Alrighty, so this one is on written and verbal feedback. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the research and some strategies to help you be effective at giving both written and verbal feedback. So the first thing we'll take a look at is how much and what type of feedback do faculty typically provide. So we'll take a look at some of the research studies in this area. I want to remind you first, though, about Wadkowski's work that really defines the characteristics of effective feedback. So we'll use this kind of as our barometer, and then we'll look at and see what faculty actually do. So, of course, we want our feedback to be connected to some kind of standard so students know whether or not they're achieving that. We want it to be informative and constructive and specific so that students can take action based on it. And then we want it also to be prompt and to kind of have frequent feedback as well. So feedback, as you know, is a very complex process. There's cognitive elements to it, the teacher-student relationship, who is giving that feedback matters. We take feedback differently depending on who it's coming from. And, feedback is a very emotional process. Many times we feel quite vulnerable sharing our work with someone and not sure whether they're going to like it or not like it, and can certainly have a lot of kind of emotional turmoil in that process. So it's really important for us to recognize the complexity of the feedback process. Here are some principles about how we can be effective at giving feedback. As you can see here, clarifying goals is important. That feedback can also facilitate good self-assessment, provides high-quality information, encourages a dialogue. It shouldn't be a one-shot deal. It really should be a conversation where we're going back and forth with the feedback process, and can be quite motivational for students to get that feedback. When students get feedback, they tend to exert a lot higher levels of effort, and again, it's a big motivator factor. Ultimately, it improves performance, so the academic product after the feedback process is going to be much better than before the feedback process. And the last one is that it guides our teaching practices, so we can determine what we can, what we might need to do better as an instructor in the class. So those are some of the general concepts. All right, so now let's shift gears and talk about what kind of feedback the students usually get. Well, this is a really interesting study that was done by Stern and Solomon. And in this study, you'll see that 30 student portfolios were examined. So they were randomly selected, and each student then had all of their work really looked at. So you can see it was a total of almost 600 papers that were reviewed. And when we take a look at some of the key findings, first of all, it looks like only 8% of those papers had rubrics attached to them. So students were really kind of left to figure out what those expectations were without very specific, rubric instructions. The other thing that you'll notice here is that the average number of marks between English faculty and non-English faculty was a little bit different, but not a giant number. It was no significant, major differences between the type of comments. It's just that the English faculty members made more technical comments. So by and large, sometimes, folks are wondering, well, I wonder if English faculty are giving different kinds of feedback than non-English faculty. And not so much, with the exception, again, of a little bit more of the technical comments. Now, when we look at the percentage of papers with at least one comment, you can see that Stern and Solomon broke it down into a variety of different categories. And by and large, most of the comments are all about grammar and punctuation, paragraph and sentence structure, word choice. And only 6% of the papers actually had more larger scale scholarly advice. So this is kind of problematic because I don't think the only thing we're concerned with is the mechanics of the writing. Clearly that's an important factor, but it shouldn't be the only factor, or maybe not even the most important factor. So is this really what we want to emphasize? Grammar skills, again, are essential. We need to be able to read the paper. It needs to be well written. But we assign the paper, unless we're an English faculty member, our purpose probably was not to promote the development of grammar skills, but instead to really probably engage in more critical thinking and higher level cognitive tasks. So what we say is important is the big picture, the organizational structure, key content that we want students to do, and yet what we end up giving feedback on is much more technical correction, so spelling and grammar and word choice. So what we're doing is we're really sending students mixed messages about this. Now, the other issue is how much feedback should we provide? So you can see here in this study by Ackerman and Gross, there was a interesting kind of issue that took place here, because if you gave a lot of feedback, you could see these orange bars here are indicating a negative impression of a student. So basically what these researchers did was they gave feedback, papers with feedback on them, and they asked them, what would you think if this feedback was provided to you? And if there was a lot of feedback, that was attached to the most negative impression of the student. So basically, a lot of feedback means the professor doesn't think highly of that student. No feedback also, didn't have that. So a low feedback was a little bit better. So the idea here is we don't want to overdo and give too much feedback, because that can backfire. And again, that's where that emotional piece comes in. So if they're feeling like it's a negative evaluation, that cannot feel so good to them, and they may not be able to even take in and hear the feedback because they're kind of too caught up in their emotional reaction to it. The other very interesting finding by Taylor was that when we spend all this time writing our feedbacks, students are not always understanding what we're telling them. In this particular study, they found that only 55% of the students realized and understood the reason or the rationale for our comment. So that means almost half of the students aren't even understanding or getting what we're saying with our feedback. So we have to really think that through, because I know as a faculty member, I spend a lot of time doing feedback, and I'm sure you do too. And we want to make sure that that feedback translates into a product that's meaningful to students. Otherwise, if they don't put it into practice, it's kind of a moot point. We're wasting our time. So one of the strategies that I wanted to spend a little bit of time with you on is the power of verbal feedback. If you remember, Wladkowski talked about it being kind of a dialogue, and it's really important that this becomes a conversation. Well, if you can carve out some time during class to provide verbal feedback, sometimes even a 1 or 2 minute conversation can give students so much more than 5 or 6 sentences that you wrote down on a piece of paper, because they can ask clarifying questions. Your emotional affect and the way that you're giving it can make it easier for students to digest and take in that information that you're giving to them. So I have become a giant fan of using verbal feedback whenever possible. And the way I think about your class time and how it's structured, providing feedback takes an enormous amount of time. However, if we think that feedback is a very powerful learning tool, then maybe it's time well spent. So maybe we can consider moving some of the other tasks outside of the classroom, so that some of our time in the classroom can be devoted to this verbal feedback. So you can do that whether it's a group working together, you can have individuals. Clearly you wouldn't have everyone sitting around doing nothing while you're providing feedback to someone. You'd probably have them engaged in some kind of group activity, and then you'd work the room and go around providing that verbal feedback. And I have found that students are super appreciative of getting that immediate, meaningful feedback, just one-on-one in person. You can do it outside the classroom as well, but of course that's a little bit more time consuming, and the logistics can sometimes be a nightmare with varied schedules and whatnot. The other way that we can provide feedback in a way that's meaningful to students is targeted feedback. So remember, one of the issues was not providing going too much and being overwhelming with how much feedback we give them. So perhaps we're collecting drafts of a paper, and we may not have time to read the drafts completely and give them all the detailed information about it, but maybe we can just look through it pretty quickly to see, are there sources on track? Did they start off with the right kind of content at least before they work on organization at all? So you might be able to quickly go through those papers to see, are they selecting the kinds of sources that you wanted them to select? Because if they don't have the basic foundational knowledge and content, the rest of it's all going to fall apart. It doesn't matter how well organized it is if the content isn't really what you're looking for. So, think about, could I collect the papers and give that targeted feedback? Another example, in addition to citations, also could be, well, is it organized in the way that you want? Like even just looking at headings or main ideas from paragraphs, main idea sentences, things of that nature. So the idea here is think about different ways that you can provide either targeted feedback or verbal feedback. It makes much better time management for you, and that really allows your students to benefit from it as well. All right, all the best with that. I hope that you find the readings and the other conversation to be valuable as you think about how you can provide effective verbal and written feedback.